November 29th, 1943, 11:47 a.m. Altitude, 20,000 feet over Bremen, Germany. Temperature, 50 degrees below zero. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran is currently experiencing the longest minute of his life. He is not flying, he is falling. But he isn't falling through the open air. He is trapped inside the severed tail section of the B-17F Rikki Tikki Tavi. Seconds ago, a direct hit from a German Messerschmitt's 20mm cannon sheared the bomber cleanly in half. The nose, the wings, the engines, and the pilots are gone. All that remains is this cramped, unpressurized metal compartment tumbling end over end through the stratosphere. The G-forces from the violent spin are crushing Moran against the fuselage walls. Outside, the sky is choked with black flak bursts and swarming fighters. Inside, Moran reaches for his chest-pack parachute, his only ticket out of this death spiral. It is shredded, useless. He is falling 4 vertical miles without a chute, locked in a metal coffin, with enemy fighters still taking shots at him. By all laws of aerodynamics and medicine, Eugene Moran is already dead. To understand how he defied gravity, the Luftwaffe, and death itself, we have to go back to the moment the mission went wrong. That mission began 4 hours earlier, on the tarmac of RAF Snetterton Heath in Norfolk, England. It was a cold, gray morning, typical for late 1943, as the ground crews of the 96th Bomb Group, the Snetterton Falcons, prepped their massive machines for war. Among the 346 B-17 flying fortresses rumbling to life, that dawn was Rikki Tikki Tavi, a B-17F serial number 4230359. For 19-year-old Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran, boarding the aircraft meant a long, solitary walk to the very rear of the fuselage. To understand the horror of what was about to happen, you have to understand the architecture of the B-17. It was built like a flying tank, legendary for absorbing punishment that would shred lesser airframes. It had 4 Wright Cyclone engines, 13 heavy machine guns, and a crew of 10. But the flying fortress had a distinct Achilles heel, the psychological and physical isolation of the tail gunner. Moran didn't sit in a chair. In the Cheyenne tail mount configuration, the gunner knelt on a pair of small pads hunched over his twin, 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. He was enclosed in a cramped plexiglass bubble at the extreme aft of the ship. Behind him was nothing but the slipstream. In front of him, separating him from the waist gunners and the rest of the crew, was a narrow, cluttered crawl space and a heavy bulkhead door. Once the bomber climbed above 10,000 feet, Moran was effectively sealed in his own world. He was tethered to the ship by only 2 thin lifelines, the rubber hose of his oxygen mask and the electrical cord of his heated flight suit. If the intercom failed, which it often did in the violence of combat, he was deaf to the pilot's commands. If the oxygen system failed, he would pass out from hypoxia in minutes. And if the heating system failed, the 50-degree below zero air outside would freeze his hands to the triggers. The formation crossed the Dutch coast and banked toward Bremen, a heavily defended industrial hub. The target was the shipyards and aircraft factories feeding the German war machine. But the Luftwaffe was waiting. Radar stations along the Kammhuber line had tracked the massive American bomber stream. Jagdgeschwader 1 and 11 scrambled their interceptors. These weren't just any fighters. They were Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 seconds, the variant known as the Gustav. Unlike the nimble dogfighters of the early war, the Gustavs were upgunned interceptors, often carrying 20mm MG 151 cannons, or even more lethal, the 30mm Mk 108 pneumatic hammer. At 23,000 feet, the serenity of the crews shattered. Bandits, 6 o'clock high. Moran spotted the specks of gray paint diving out of the sun. The tail gunner is the shield of the formation. His job is to lay down a wall of lead to keep the fighters at bay, forcing them to break off their attack runs early. Moran gripped the spade handles of his twin Brownings. The vibration of the heavy machine guns rattled his entire skeletal frame as he fired short, controlled bursts. Bright orange tracers arced out to meet the incoming Germans. He saw hits. Smoke trailed from one of the Messerschmitts as it peeled away. But there were too many of them. The German tactics had evolved. They weren't just spraying bullets, they were slashing through the formation, coordinating their attacks with the heavy flak batteries on the ground. Black puffs of anti-aircraft fire, Fliegerabwehrkanonen, began to blossom around Rikki Tikki Tavi. Flak is terrifying not because of the noise, which is drowned out by the engines, but because of the physics of the shrapnel. A jagged chunk of hot steel, moving at supersonic speed, doesn't just puncture aluminum, it tears through structural spars like a chainsaw through balsa wood. The bomber took a catastrophic hit near the waist section. Whether it was a concentrated burst of 20mm cannon fire from a fighter or a direct hit from an 88mm flak shell remains a point of debate, but the result was indisputable. The explosion didn't just damage the skin, it severed the longerons, the main structural spines running the length of the fuselage. From his kneeling position in the tail, Moran felt a violent, sickening lurch. It wasn't the turbulence of near misses he was used to. This was different. The floor beneath his knees dropped away. Through the thick plexiglass, he watched a sight that defied comprehension. The forward section of Rikki Tikki Tavi, the wings, the engines, the cockpit where his friends were fighting for their lives, was moving away from him. It was sliding forward and down, trailing fire and smoke. He wasn't falling out of the plane. The plane had left him behind. The tail section, severed just aft of the waist gunner's windows, was now a separate, unpowered object. The oxygen hose snapped. The intercom wire tore free. The electrical heating cord sparked and died. In a heartbeat, Eugene Moran went from being a soldier in a heavily armed fortress to a castaway in a freezing, tumbling aluminum cage. Most airmen in this situation died instantly. The sudden aerodynamic drag usually ripped the tail assembly apart, or the centrifugal force of the spin would stroke out the gunner's brain before he could even think to bail out. But as the wreckage began its plunge toward the German countryside, the laws of physics decided to play a strange trick. Instead of plummeting like a stone, the tail section caught the air. And that air became the only thing standing between Sergeant Moran and a crater in the German soil. When the fuselage snapped, the tail section didn't behave like a dead weight, it behaved like a seed pod. To understand this accidental miracle, we have to look at the unintentional engineering of the B-17's empennage. In aviation design, stability is usually the enemy of maneuverability. But here, stability was the only thing that mattered. The B-17 tail section is a massive structure. The vertical stabilizer stands over 13 feet tall, and the horizontal stabilizers span 43 feet wider than the wings of many fighter aircraft. When attached to the bomber, these surfaces keep the plane flying straight. Detached, they became a crude, unpowered glider. Crucially, the weight distribution was completely lopsided. The front of this new jagged flying object was the breakpoint, loaded with heavy ammunition boxes, armor plating, the twin, 50 caliber machine guns, and Moran himself. The rear was the hollow, lightweight aluminum of the tail cone and stabilizers. This created a phenomenon known in ballistics as shuttlecock stability. Just as the heavy cork of a badminton birdie always orients itself forward while the feathers create drag behind it, the severed tail section pitched forward, break end down. But because of the massive surface area of the horizontal stabilizers, it couldn't dive straight. Instead, it entered a violent, flat spin, a maneuver aerodynamically similar to a maple seed falling from a tree. This is called autorotation. In a standard freefall, a human body reaches terminal velocity, the point where air resistance equals the pull of gravity at roughly 120 miles per hour. A streamlined object, like a bomb or a nose-down aircraft fuselage, can exceed 300 miles per hour. If Moran had fallen at those speeds, the impact would have liquefied his internal organs instantly. But the spinning tail section was fighting the air every inch of the way. The rotation created a massive vortex of drag, acting as a dynamic air brake. Aviation forensic analysis suggests that this drag slashed his terminal velocity by nearly 70%, slowing his descent to somewhere between 30 and 40 miles per hour. It was still fast enough to kill, but slow enough to leave a margin for a miracle. Inside the turret, however, it didn't feel like a miracle. It felt like a washing machine set to spin at 20,000 feet. Moran wasn't floating, he was being crushed. As the tail whipped around, centrifugal force pinned him against the plexiglass and steel framing. His world was a blur of gray sky and brown earth, strobing past his vision 60 times a minute. The G-forces pulled the blood from his head, threatening to plunge him into G-lock G-force-induced loss of consciousness. Yet, in this chaotic tumble, something even stranger happened. something that has become the stuff of Air Force legend, debated in mess halls for 80 years. Witnesses, both Allied airmen in nearby bombers and reports from the ground, saw tracers erupting from the falling wreckage. The script of war says that when a plane is shot down, the fight is over. But the falling tail section of Rikki Tikki Tavi was still fighting. As German Bf-109 seconds circled the debris field, looking to pick off any parachutes or confirm the kill, they were met with bursts of 50 caliber fire. Skeptics argue that the G-forces simply slammed Moran's body against the spade grips, depressing the triggers involuntarily. It is a plausible, cynical explanation. But combat stress physiology suggests another possibility: the startle reflex override. In the terrifying confusion of the breakup, with his hands already frozen on the triggers, Moran's brain may have locked into a singular, primitive loop: target, fire, target, fire. Whether it was conscious defiance or a neuromuscular spasm doesn't matter to the history books. What matters is the effect. A German fighter pilot, banking in to admire his handiwork, suddenly saw the dead wreckage lighting him up. It was a psychological shock. The sheer impossibility of return fire from a piece of debris forced the attackers to keep their distance. They peeled off, unwilling to risk their aircraft against a ghost. The fighters vanished, leaving Moran alone with the physics. The firing stopped. The ammunition belts were either empty or the centrifugal force had jammed the feed chutes. Now, there was only the wind. The altimeter on the panel, miraculously still functioning, unwound with terrifying speed. 15,000 feet. 10,000 feet. The air grew thicker, screaming through the torn metal of the forward bulkhead. The temperature rose from 50 below to near freezing, but Moran couldn't feel it. He was battered, likely concussed, and trapped in a death spiral that no amount of willpower could stop. He tried to reach the escape hatch, but the G-forces glued him to the side of the fuselage. Even if he could move, the frame was likely twisted, the door jammed. He was a prisoner of the spin, 5,000 feet. The blur of the ground resolved into details. Green patches, dark lines of roads, and directly below him, the dark, bristling carpet of a pine forest near the town of Syke. The heretical solution of the spinning tail had saved him from the fall through the stratosphere, scrubbing off hundreds of miles per hour of speed. But aerodynamics can only do so much. The ground has a drag coefficient of infinity. Moran was about to test the limits of human fragility against the immovable earth. That impact was not immediate, and that was the true torture. The cruelty of the autorotation effect was that it didn't just slow Moran's fall, it prolonged it. If Moran had fallen free, reaching terminal velocity, the descent from 20,000 feet would have taken roughly 2 minutes. A terrifying, but brief, plummet. But because the tail section was spiraling, acting as a jagged, inefficient air brake, his descent time stretched. Forensic reconstruction suggests Eugene Moran spent between 4 and 5 minutes falling. 5 minutes is a lifetime when you are waiting to die. As the tail section descended through the layers of the atmosphere, Moran was subjected to a system of rejection, a physiological gauntlet designed to destroy the human body long before it hits the ground. The first stage was the pressure. At 20,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure is roughly half that of sea level. As the wreckage plunged downward at 40 miles per hour, the air density thickened rapidly. For a dive bomber pilot in a controlled descent, this pressure change is manageable. For a man tumbling in a broken centrifuge, it is agonizing. The rapid compression hammered against Moran's eardrums. His sinuses would have felt like they were being spiked with ice picks, a condition known as acute barotrauma. Blood likely began to pool in his middle ear, deafening him to the scream of the wind just as the air became thick enough to carry sound. Then came the temperature shock. He had spent hours at 50 degrees below zero, his body preserved in a state of near cryogenic stasis. Now, as he dropped below 10,000 feet, the mercury climbed. The sudden thaw brought sensation back to his extremities, not as relief, but as the burning needles of returning circulation. He was thawing out just in time to feel the pain of the crash. On the ground, the system was watching. 12 miles south of Bremen, in the small town of Syke, German civilians looked up. The air raid sirens had long since wailed, and the main bomber stream had passed, leaving contrails dissipating in the cold sky. But now, something else was coming down. Witnesses described it not as a crash, but as a falling leaf. From the ground, the terror of the spin looked almost graceful. The tail section would dip a stabilizer, catch the air, swing wide, and then dip again. It was a chaotic pendulum, swinging wildly as it lost altitude. To the observers, it looked like debris, just another piece of scrap metal from the terror terrorizing their cities. They had no idea a man was inside, watching them get larger. Inside the turret, the grace was gone. The shuttlecock effect kept the tail brake end down, meaning Moran was effectively falling feet first, facing backward, watching the sky recede while his peripheral vision caught the blurring horizon. The centrifugal force pressed him relentlessly against the bulkhead. Even if he had the strength to move, the physics of the spin pinned him in place like an insect in a jar. He was trapped in a paradox. The very forces saving his life, the drag and the spin, were also the forces incapacitating him, preventing any attempt at a controlled exit. He couldn't jump. He couldn't steer. He could only wait. This is the psychological system of rejection, at its most brutal. In most survival stories, the hero acts. He cuts a line, he pulls a lever, he shoots a bandit. Here, Moran was stripped of all agency. The military machine had put him in the plane. The enemy had destroyed the plane, and gravity had claimed the wreckage. He was a passenger on a voyage to oblivion. At 2,000 feet, the details of the earth became razor sharp. The abstract map of Germany resolved into individual rooftops, roads, and fields. He could likely see the gray slate of the farmhouses. He could see the snow-dusted furrows of the plowland, and he could see the forest. The B-17 tail section was drifting toward a dense patch of pine woods just outside Syke. This was the final variable in the equation. Had the wind blown 2 degrees to the east, he would have impacted the frozen, concrete-hard dirt of a plowed field, and the deceleration would have killed him instantly. Had it blown 2 degrees west, he might have hit the slate roof of a barn, shattering the structure and his body. But the system of rejection had one final failure. It delivered him to the trees. The canopy of the pine forest rushed up to meet him. The spin rate seemed to increase as the ground filled his vision. The noise of the wind rose to a shriek, finally piercing his deafened ears. Moran likely didn't have time to brace himself. He didn't have time to pray. He simply ran out of sky. The impact was not a single event. It was a violent, cascading series of collisions. The tail section smashed into the treetops at roughly 40 miles per hour. The first branch snapped, absorbing a fraction of the kinetic energy. Then the next, and the next. The vertical stabilizer, that 13-foot dorsal fin, acted like a massive anchor hook, snagging on the upper limbs of an 80-foot pine. The aluminum skin shrieked as it tore. The structural ribs of the stabilizer buckled, converting the energy of the fall into the deformation of metal. The tail section didn't stop dead. It whipped through the canopy, cartwheeling downward, shedding speed with every snapped branch and shattered trunk. It was a chaotic, terrifying tumbling through the timber, a violent deceleration from 40 miles per hour to 0 in the span of 2 seconds. Then, silence. The wreckage came to rest at the base of the trees, steaming in the cold winter air. The tail section was unrecognizable, a twisted, crumpled mass of aluminum and plexiglass. Inside, buried under the debris of his own turret, Eugene Moran lay motionless. The fall was over. The physics had done their job. Now, the biology would have to survive the aftermath. The system had failed to kill him in the air, so it prepared to kill him on the ground. He was broken, bleeding, and alone in enemy territory, surrounded by the people he had just been bombing. But the first figures to emerge from the tree line weren't holding rifles. They were carrying a medical bag, and they weren't Germans. They were ghosts of the Reich's conquest, Serbian prisoners of war, conscripted as slave labor. Specifically, they were Dr. Milan Popovic and Dr. Chanak, former officers in the Royal Yugoslav Army, captured during the German invasion of 1941. For 2 years, the Nazi ideology had classified them as untermenschen subhumans fit only for forced labor. But in the frozen woods outside Syke, these 2 men reclaimed their authority. They weren't slaves, they were physicians. And they were the only reason Eugene Moran didn't bleed to death in the snow. The crash site was a scene of carnage. The tail section lay shattered, its aluminum skin ripped open like a tin can, exposing the twisted ribs of the airframe. Inside, Moran was barely recognizable as a human being. He was unconscious, slumped over his gun sight. The impact had driven his head into the steel machinery, causing a massive depressed skull fracture. His ribs were pulverized. Both of his forearms were snapped, dangling at sickening angles where they had impacted the gun mounts. By every metric of trauma medicine, this was a recovery operation, not a rescue. Popovich and Chanek didn't hesitate. Ignoring the risk of being accused of looting or sabotage by approaching German patrols, they scrambled into the wreckage. They had no morphine, they had no plasma, they had only the rags on their backs and the training in their hands. They pulled Moran from the turret, laying him on the frozen ground. The cold, which had tortured him during the fall, now became a momentary ally, constricting his blood vessels and slowing the hemorrhage from his scalp. Popovich worked to stabilize the American's head, recognizing the signs of severe cranial trauma. One wrong move could sever the spinal cord. Chanek used strips of cloth torn from their own meager clothing to bind Moran's shattered arms to his chest, splinting them against his body to prevent further bone displacement. It was a surreal tableau. Two starving prisoners saving the life of a man who, just minutes earlier, had been dropping high explosives on the very ground they stood on. Then the shouting started. Halt! Hände hoch! German soldiers emerged from the perimeter, Mauser rifles raised, bolts cycling. These weren't the elite Luftwaffe pilots from the sky. These were ground troops, agitated and expecting to find an armed crew. They saw the wreckage, the enemy terror flyer, and the two Serbians kneeling over him. The tension was absolute. In the chaos of the air raid aftermath, summary execution was a real possibility. A nervous trigger finger could have ended all three lives right there. But Popovich didn't back away. He gestured to the wounds, to the blood, asserting his role as a doctor. He shifted the dynamic from combatant capture to medical emergency. The German sergeant lowered his rifle. The sheer extent of Moran's injuries made it clear he was no threat. In fact, the Germans seemed baffled that he was alive at all. They had watched the tail section fall from 4 miles up. They expected a corpse to tag and bury. Instead, they had a breathing patient. The system of rejection shifted gears. Moran was loaded onto a stretcher, his body screaming in agony as he drifted in and out of consciousness. He was transported not to a prison cell, but to a military hospital in Bremen, the same city he had targeted that morning. The irony was absolute. The bombs from Moran's squadron had likely filled that very hospital with German casualties. Now, Luftwaffe doctors were tasked with saving the man who helped put them there. Upon arrival, the German medical staff examined the tail gunner, who fell from space. Their assessment was grim. The skull fracture was critical. Shards of bone were pressing on the brain. The double arm fractures were complex. His lungs were bruised, his kidneys battered by the G-forces. He is finished, one doctor reportedly noted. Don't waste the supplies. In 1943 Germany, medical supplies were precious. Penicillin was non-existent for them. Sulfa drugs were rationed. Prioritizing a dying enemy over their own wounded was tantamount to treason. But whether out of professional curiosity or a strange respect for his survival, they treated him. They cleaned the wounds. They set the bones poorly, as his arms would forever be locked at awkward angles, but they set them. Moran lay in a delirium for days. When he woke, he found himself in a new kind of hell. The physical pain was blinding, a constant white noise that drowned out thought. But the psychological terror was worse. He was alone. His crew was dead. He was in the heart of the enemy nation, a broken trophy of the Third Reich. German intelligence officers, the Abwehr, came to his bedside. They didn't need to torture him physically. His body was already doing that. They wanted to know about the new B-17 formations, the radar jamming chaff, the target lists. Moran, barely able to speak through his cracked jaw, fell back on the only defense he had left. Name, rank, serial number. Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran. 190-50975. He gave them nothing else. The Germans eventually lost interest. He was a broken toy, no longer useful for intelligence, and too damaged to be a threat. In their eyes, the war was over for Eugene Moran. They assumed he would rot in a camp until the end of hostilities. But they had miscalculated. The fall hadn't killed him. The impact hadn't killed him. The lack of medicine hadn't killed him. Eugene Moran had just survived the most violent physical trauma a human being can endure. He was toughened now, his survival instinct forged in the crucible of a 4-mile drop. And he would need every ounce of that iron, because the true test wasn't the fall. The true test was coming. As the Red Army pushed from the east and the Allies from the west, the Third Reich would begin to eat itself, and it planned to take its prisoners down with it. Moran was about to be transferred to Stalag Luft EV, and from there, he would face a trial that made the fall look like the easy part. The winter of 1945 was approaching, and with it, the order for the Black March. That test arrived with the roar of Soviet artillery. By January 1945, Eugene Moran had survived 14 months inside the wire of Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania. He had healed, after a fashion. His skull fracture had knitted over, leaving him with chronic headaches. His ribs had mended, but his arms set without surgery or casts had fused at permanent, useless 15-degree angles. He could not button his own shirt. He could not tie his boots. He was physically dependent on his fellow prisoners for the most basic acts of survival. Then, on the morning of February 6th, the camp commandant issued the order, evacuate. The Red Army was less than 20 miles away. The Third Reich, collapsing in a spasm of paranoia, refused to let 10,000 Allied airmen be liberated. Instead, they ordered a mass movement westward, deep into the shattering heart of Germany. History would remember it as the Schwarzer Marsch, the Black March. It was a logistical nightmare designed by madmen. 10,000 starving men were shoved out of the barracks into a blizzard that has been recorded as one of the coldest in European history. Temperatures dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The snow was knee-deep. For a healthy man, the march was a death sentence. For Eugene Moran, a man with a fused skeleton and compromised circulation, it was an impossibility. He walked out of the gate wearing a thin greatcoat and mismatched boots. He carried nothing, because his twisted arms couldn't hold the weight of a pack. He relied entirely on the buddy system, the unwritten law of the POW camps. Men who had never met him before the crash, men who hadn't fallen 4 miles from the sky, now took turns feeding him, dressing him, and shielding him from the wind. The column stretched for miles, a gray snake of misery winding through the frozen Prussian landscape. They walked 20 miles a day. There were no rations. They ate snow for water. They scavenged frozen turnips from the roadside fields, risking a bullet from the guards for a mouthful of rotten vegetable. This was the vindication of the human spirit, played out in slow motion. The heretical solution of the tail section had saved Moran from gravity, but now, sheer stubbornness was the only thing saving him from biology. Dysentery swept through the ranks. Men simply stopped walking, sitting down in the snow, too exhausted to care about the Luger pistol the guard would put to the back of their neck moments later. The roads were lined with the corpses of those who couldn't keep the pace. Moran walked. His feet, ravaged by frostbite, turned black and gangrenous. The pain was absolute, a rhythmic agony with every step. Yet, the man who had watched his aircraft disintegrate and his friends die refused to be the one left in the snow. He had cheated the Luftwaffe at 20,000 feet. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of dying in a ditch at sea level. The march lasted for 86 days. They covered nearly 600 miles, zigzagging across Germany, herded like cattle away from the advancing Allied armies. They slept in open fields, in barns, in pigsties. They were strafed by their own Air Force, American P-47 Thunderbolts, mistaking the gray column for German infantry. By April 1945, the column had reached the town of Bitterfeld, near the Elbe River. The guards were nervous. The sound of artillery wasn't coming from the east anymore. It was coming from the west. The deep, rhythmic thumping of American 105mm howitzers. On April 26th, the guards vanished. They simply melted away into the forests, shedding their uniforms, terrified of the retribution coming their way. The prisoners were left in a chaotic limbo, huddled in a filthy, abandoned factory. And then, the doors were kicked in. Soldiers from the U.S. 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves, stormed the building, weapons raised. They were combat-hardened infantry, men who had fought from Normandy to the Rhine. But veterans later recalled that the smell inside that factory stopped them in their tracks. It was the smell of rot, disease, and death on an industrial scale. When the medics reached Eugene Moran, they didn't see a hero. They saw a skeleton. He weighed less than 100 pounds. His eyes were sunken into the dark hollows of his skull fracture. His hands were frozen claws. His feet were rotting in his boots. A medic began to cut away the boots, and the skin came with them. The triage assessment was immediate. Severe malnutrition, advanced gangrene, multiple improperly healed fractures, post-traumatic stress. "How did you get here, soldier?" an officer asked. Moran's voice was a rasp, But the answer was the final seal on his vindication. He hadn't just survived a fall, he had survived the war. "I walked," he said. They loaded him onto a jeep, then an ambulance, then a C-47 transport plane. The ripple effect of his survival began immediately. As Moran was evacuated to a military hospital in France, and eventually back to the United States, his story began to filter through the Army Air Forces. It wasn't just a barroom tale. It was data. The fact that he survived the fall validated the structural robustness of the B-17 tail assembly, proving that the Cheyenne turret, while a death trap in combat, was surprisingly aerodynamic in a breakup. But more importantly, his survival of the march validated the SARE, survival, evasion, resistance, and escape training doctrines that were just beginning to take shape. It proved that the human body could endure trauma far beyond the theoretical limits calculated by medical boards, provided the psychological will, the refusal to accept the system of rejection remained intact. Eugene Moran returned to Wisconsin, not as a conqueror, but as a survivor. He had left as a farm boy. He returned as a medical anomaly. The doctors wanted to amputate his feet. He refused. They wanted to re-break his arms to set them straight. He refused. He had spent enough time in hospitals. He just wanted to go home. But the story doesn't end with his return. Because while Moran's survival was a miracle of physics and grit, it was also part of a pattern. He wasn't the only one. And to understand the true, deeper truth of what happened that day over Bremen, we have to look at the other men who fell from the sky and lived to tell about it. The universe, it seemed, had a loophole. That loophole is rare, but it is scientifically repeatable, provided you have the terrifying luck to align 3 specific variables: drag, cushion, and care. Eugene Moran was not the only airman to fall from the stratosphere without a parachute and live. He belongs to perhaps the most exclusive and horrific fraternity of the Second World War, the chuteless. To understand the magnitude of his survival, we have to place him alongside the other 2 anomalies of the air war: Flight Sergeant Nicholas Alcamaid of the Royal Air Force and Staff Sergeant Alan McGee of the U.S. 8th Air Force. In January 1943, McGee fell 20,000 feet from a B-17 over Street Nazaire, France. He crashed through the glass roof of the main train station, which shattered upon impact, acting as a massive energy absorber, before landing on the steel girders below. In March 1944, Alcamaid jumped from a burning Lancaster bomber at 18,000 feet without a chute. He landed in a deep snowdrift in a pine forest, spraining his ankle but suffering no broken bones. When we overlay Moran's experience with theirs, the deeper truth of these miracles emerges. It wasn't divine intervention. It was the physics of impact attenuation. The human body is surprisingly resilient to speed, but it is incredibly fragile to deceleration. It's not the fall that kills you, it's the stop. If a body hits concrete at terminal velocity roughly 120 miles per hour, the deceleration distance is 0. The G-load spikes to over 500 Gs instantly. The brain shears from the brainstem, the aorta detaches from the heart, and death is instantaneous. But Moran, McGee, and Alcamaid all hit soft targets. For McGee, the glass roof absorbed the kinetic energy, shattering to slow him down over the space of a few milliseconds before he hit the beams. For Alcamaid, the pine branches and deep snow acted as a progressive brake, spreading the deceleration over several feet. Moran's survival was the most complex of the 3. He had the drag from the autorotating tail section, which reduced his speed to a survivable 40 miles per hour. Then, he had the cushion. The pine forest outside Psych acted like the crumple zone of a modern car. As the tail section smashed through the canopy, every snapping branch and splintering trunk did work, robbing the falling mass of its energy. By the time the wreckage hit the forest floor, the lethal G-force spike had been smoothed out into a survivable, albeit bone-shattering, curve. But the third variable, care, is where Moran's story diverges into tragedy and triumph. Alcamaid was captured by curious Germans who were so impressed they signed his autograph book. McGee was given top-tier medical treatment. Moran was saved by the sheer moral courage of 2 Serbian slave laborers. Remove Dr. Popovic and Dr. Chanak from the equation, and Moran dies of shock and exposure in the woods, a statistic rather than a survivor. This is the legacy Eugene Moran carried back to Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin. It wasn't a legacy of glamour. When he stepped off the train in 1945, he wasn't the man of steel. He was a 21-year-old with the body of a geriatric. His arms were permanently twisted, limiting his range of motion. He lived with constant, dull pain in his ribs and skull. The nightmares of the spin, the vertigo of the void, haunted his sleep for decades. Yet, he refused to let the physics define him. He married Helen, the woman he met at a church social, and together they raised 9 children. He couldn't lift heavy loads, so he found ways to work around his injuries. He worked in construction, adapting his grip to fit the tools, hiding the pain behind a stoic Midwestern silence. He rarely spoke of the war. To his neighbors, he was just Gene, the guy with the crooked arms who liked to fish. This silence was his final armor. The competitor's narrative often paints these men as bragging heroes, but the reality of the greatest generation was often one of profound repression. They had seen the world break apart, and their response was to come home and meticulously build a small, quiet world that made sense. Moran didn't see himself as a miracle. He saw himself as a man who had simply done what was necessary. He had fallen 4 miles, survived the crash, survived the neglect, survived the death march, and survived the peace. In 2007, when a local historian finally sat him down to record the story, Moran was in his 80s. He recounted the events with the detached precision of an engineer. He didn't talk about fear, he talked about the altimeter. He didn't talk about heroism, he talked about the Serbian doctors. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, that he was a glitch in the matrix of total war. The industrial machine of the 20th century had spent millions of dollars and millions of lives trying to kill men like him. It had built flak cannons, fighter planes, and concentration camps. And yet, on the 29th of November 1943, the machine failed. A farm boy from Wisconsin fell through the cracks of the system, cushioned by the trees and caught by the hands of the oppressed. Eugene Moran died in 2014 at the age of 90. He outlived the Third Reich by 69 years. He outlived the B-17. He outlived the Soviet Union. He won, not because he was invincible, but because he endured. But as we close the file on the tail gunner who wouldn't die, we are left with one lingering question. Moran survived because his aircraft broke apart. But what happens when the aircraft refuses to die? What happens when the machine itself becomes the ghost? That ghost appeared almost exactly 1 year later, in the skies over Belgium. While Eugene Moran was freezing in Stalag Luft 4, another B-17, the Phantom Fortress, would perform a feat just as impossible as his fall. It would touch down on a British airfield with its landing gear down, its engines running, and its bomb bay doors open, but with absolutely no one on board. The crew had bailed out hours earlier, yet the machine flew itself home. That mystery, which baffled investigators and terrified ground crews, is a story for our next briefing. But for Eugene Moran, the mystery ended where it began, on the quiet soil of Wisconsin. He spent his remaining years on the farm, surrounded by the peace he had paid for in blood. The war had taken his youth, his physical comfort, and his peace of mind, but it failed to take his humanity. Every time he buttoned his shirt with those twisted fingers, it was a silent act of defiance against the gravity that tried to kill him and the regime that tried to break him. His story reminds us that history isn't just written by the generals who move flags on a map. It is written by the tail gunners who freeze in the slipstream, the doctors who refuse to see enemies in the wounded, and the sheer, stubborn biological will to keep breathing when the world falls apart. Eugene Moran fell 4 miles. He hit the ground, and then he stood up. If you want to help us preserve these forgotten chapters of military history, the most effective weapon you have is that like button. It tells the algorithm that these stories matter. And if you haven't enlisted yet, hit subscribe and ring the bell. We are digging through the archives to find the stories the textbooks left out. The B-17 that landed without a pilot is waiting for you in this video right here. Click it, and I'll see you on the flight line.